Hello everyone, this is Pablo from the C# Academy. In today's tutorial, we're going to build a fully functioning CRUD application, a beautiful to-do list in ASP.NET MVC. This application is suited for beginners, so if you know the basics but haven't done any projects, or if you already have a little bit of experience, this is the right project for you. In this application, we're going to use ASP.NET MVC, ADO.NET, so no entity framework, a little bit of Bootstrap for the front end, and a tiny bit of JavaScript using jQuery library. Even though this is a beginner project, you need to know at least basic C#. You also need to have installed in your computer the ASP.NET environment, have basic understanding of HTML and CSS. If you haven't worked with any SQL or databases before, or if you only used Entity Framework, I suggest you watch at least one of the projects in the links below where we focus on SQL in the back end. This is a very practical project. We're not going to explain every little thing in detail. So here are a few tips to watch this tutorial. The first one is to take notes, which really helps you to retain the content. And if you get stuck or don't understand something that has been explained, hover over the code with your mouse. C# does a very good job at explaining what every piece of code does. Also, get into the habit of using the debugger. This way you can understand the flow of data in your application. Last but not least, don't forget to search. Most of your questions have already been asked and answered in places like Stack Overflow. And you can also always ask questions in the comments below. I will reply to all of them. So let's get started. Alright, so the first thing that we need to do is to create a folder for our project. So in Visual Studio Code, if you click on Open Folder and New Folder, you can name it whatever you want. So let's name it Beautiful To-Do List, because our to-do list will be gorgeous. Once you do that, Visual Studio Code will be open in that folder that you just created. So now let's open a terminal so we can create our project. And you can do that by running the command .NET new MVC --name and the name of your project, which will be to do. With that command, .NET will ship you an application ready to go. That's what we call scaffolding. It's a complete application right out of the box with all the boilerplate code necessary to run an MVC application. If you examine the files generated by .NET, you can see that there is a controllers folder, a models folder, properties, views, and root. We also have app settings.json, which will store configuration information for our app. And then we have program.cs and startup.cs, which will set up and run our application. Last but not least, we have todo.csproj, which contains settings for our project, such as which files are included as part of the project. Basically, any information on how and what is needed to properly compile our project assembly. We're going to explain what each folder and file does as we build our app. But for now, make sure you click Yes on this dialog. This will create a .vs Code folder, which contains information about building and debugging your app. Without this, your application won't run. If for whatever reason you don't see this dialog, you can press Command-Shift-P on Mac or Ctrl-Shift-P on Windows, which will open your command palette, and then you can build those assets. Before we continue, let's run our application and see what happens. So as you can see, we have a fully functioning page, has a nice menu, and a main page with a welcome header. And we can click on the links and they all work. Now, before we start coding, let's get rid of some files that we won't need in this application. So the first one will be the privacy.cs HTML. Everything that's in the views folder will be a view. What does that mean? That means that that's where our HTML code will be for each page we want to display. One of those pages will be the home page. Now, we also have a shared folder that contains all the HTML that we want to display in every page. We can also delete the error page, since we won't have an error page in our to-do list. And that means that we can also delete our error view model. View models are types of objects that contain properties for everything we want to display on our page. C# is a strongly typed language. That means that it encourages us to create types, to create objects for everything, including the information that we want to display. The concept of view models will make more sense when we actually have to build one, not far from now. So let's replace the error view model with a model. So that's going to be our to-do model, which will be used to help us interact with the database in the controller. The to-do type will have an ID, which will be an integer, and a name, which will be a string. Let's also make sure we change the name of the file to keep things organized. And let's carry on with the changes in the controller. In the controller, each method will be correspondent to a page. So as you can see, we have an index method, which means that whenever we hit that method, we're going to be interacting with the index page. And since we deleted the privacy page and the error page, that means that we can get rid of those methods. But now let's move on to make changes in the layout page. As I said before, the layout contains the code that will be shared by all the pages in the application. So you can see that there is a lot of pre-generated code going on here. In the header, we have the links to our style sheets. ASP.NET ships MVC applications with Bootstrap attached to it. Bootstrap is just a library that helps us to display our pages more beautifully, and that saves us a lot of trouble with CSS, JavaScript, and HTML. There is a link below with my favorite Bootstrap course. All you need is a crash course to understand the basics, and then you can carry on building whatever you want. So in this boilerplate, there are a bunch of Bootstrap classes. That's how Bootstrap works. It pre-styles a bunch of classes using CSS, and then we apply them as needed. Let's get rid of all Bootstrap classes for now. We're going to use them later after our application is functional. So for now, let's just keep the container, a main tag, and a render body method. The render body must be present, and you can only have one render body, and it renders all the content of the child view, which is not wrapped in a name section. So whenever you want to build a page that has many sections, you're going to place them under different names. And everything that's not part of these named sections will be rendered by the render body. Let's also get rid of the footer since we don't need one for this application. And you also notice that you have your scripts linking our page to JavaScript, which also is shipped with the basic MVC template. So now we have a much less crowded layout view. Alright, so after so much setup, it's time to finally start coding. So let's go to our shared folder and let's create the page where our form will live. So it's going to be called underline form, and the underline is just a convention that's commonly used for views. And for now, the content of this view will just be a phrase. The form will be here. And we're going to do the same in the index file. That will be rendered by the render body method. And that's where the table will live. Then in the layout view, we're going to create a partial. So we're going to use the @html.partial with the name of the file that we want to display in that partial. In that case, that's the form. So the partial tag will display that section, that specific section, and the render body method will display the index. Now let's have a look at our startup.cs. We have an app.useEndpoints method, and that's what dictates the routes in our application. Here we can see that our default route we will look for an index action in the home controller with an optional ID. And the fact that we set that route up as our default means that if we try to access our base URL without anything in front of it, we're going to trigger the default action. So in our case, the base URL is localhost and the port 5001. If we don't add anything to that URL, the method that will be triggered is the index method of the home controller. So now, if we try to run the application, this is the result. We have the form page where we want it to be on top and the table page underneath. So now let's finally create our form. So I'm going to bring in some code and let's understand what's going on. We're going to use a very powerful feature of ASP.NET MVC. So everything that you can see in green in these tags is a tag helper. Tag helpers enable the server-side code to create and render HTML elements. And that allows us to interact with our models. So notice that each of these tags interact with our to-do model, which was declared on top of the page. So that means that this page is bound to the to-do model. And notice the similarity between the tag helpers and HTML tags. So we have a form, a div, a label, an input, span. They are all HTML tags, and ultimately this code will render HTML in the browser. So let's run the app again, and we have our form. It doesn't look great, but we're going to fix that later. Now it's time to make the form work. So the first thing that we need to do is to insert a to-do item to our to-do list. However, we still don't have a database. So let's create it now. We're going to use SQLite, which is a widely used lightweight solution for databases, and it doesn't require a lot of setup. In the root folder of our project, let's create a file called db.sqlite. If you right-click on this file and choose Open Database, you can open the SQLite Explorer and we'll find our empty database. Now let's run an SQL script to create our table. Right-click on the database, choose New Query, and the command will be Create Table to do. The table will have an ID property and a name property. The ID will be an integer and the name will be text. Notice that the notation for strings in SQLite is slightly different from SQL Server if you have worked with it before. In SQLite we use text, whereas in SQL Server we would use varchar. We also have two extra properties on the ID property. The first being primary key, which means that the ID will be the identifier for that row, and auto increment, which means that the ID will increment itself every time we add a new record. Now let's right-click on the script and choose Run Query. And if you refresh the database, you can see the table is now there. Now we need to add a NuGet package that allows us to use SQLite in our project. So press Command-Shift-P to open the command palette, choose Add Package, and search for Microsoft.data.sqlite. And I'm choosing to install version 5 because I have .NET 5 running in my computer. Now I haven't noticed before that the compiler is complaining about a conflict between the namespace to do, which is the name of the project, and the type to do that we created for our model. So let's refactor it by changing the name of our model from to do to to-do item. Now let's go back to our controller, and we need to create a method that will be responsible for inserting the data in our table. First, we need to create an instance of the SQLite connection class provided by the package that we downloaded from NuGet package, and we are wrapping it in a using statement because SQLite connection is an unmanaged resource. That means that we need to dispose of it so that it doesn't keep using our memory in the background. Then we have to create a command that also is an unmanaged resource, which means that it also needs to be wrapped in a using statement. Then we open the connection, we create this string as the command text property of our SQLite command, and the command is fairly simple. We're using insert into the name of our table. In between brackets, we are saying the name of the property that we're going to insert, and then the value will be provided via string interpolation, and it will be todo.name. Don't forget the $sign in front of the string, the curly brackets around todo.name, and the quotes around the property that we want to insert. If you look at the signature of our insert method, you can see that it's void, which means that it's not supposed to return anything, and we're passing a to-do item object as an argument. Then we are executing the command using the method execute non-query, and that means that we are not querying the database. We're not asking questions of it, so we don't want to return any values from it. I'm wrapping a try-catch block around it so that it makes it easier to debug. Whenever you run this command when developing the application, if something goes wrong in SQLite, we're going to return a message with an error, and that makes it much easier to debug. After that, we don't need to close the connection or the command because the using statements take care of that. Now, to keep things consistent and organized, let's change the name of the model file to to-do item. Now let's test our form to see if everything is working. I'm going to try to add groceries to my list, and if I go to SQLite Explorer, right-click on the table and choose Show Table, I can see that the data is there. At the moment, we're being redirected to a page with the URL home/insert, and that page doesn't exist. Let's change that. Let's go back to our controller and change the return type of our insert method to redirect result. We have many different types that we can return in a controller, and that gives us great flexibility. And now we need to return a redirect result with our base URL. So let's add another record to our table, and now we refresh the page after the method is run. And the data was correctly added. Now it's time to fetch data from the database so we can display our to-do items. Let's create a method called getAllToDos, and that method is going to return a to-do view model, which we're still going to create. And then we need to create a list. It's going to be called to-do list, and it's going to be a list of to-do items. Then we need to follow a pattern that's similar to what we did before. We're declaring an SQLite connection object, wrapping it in a using statement, and passing the connection string. And we're doing the same with an SQLite command, also wrapping it in a using statement. Then we are opening the connection and creating a command that's fairly simple. Select everything from to do. And then to read from our database, we have to create a reader. So that's an instance of the SQLite reader class. Let's examine the code because it can be confusing if this is your first time. The reader is going to return a boolean, and this boolean is called has rows. If this boolean is true, we're going to run a while loop. And if it's not true, we're going to return an empty to-do view model. So in case the table has rows, we're going to run this loop. And this loop runs while the reader is reading data from the database. That means that when there are no more rows, the reader stops reading and we get out of the loop. Now, for each row that the reader returns from the database, we're going to add a new to-do item to our to-do item list. If you don't understand that part of the code at first, it's absolutely normal. You just have to read it carefully a few times. There's nothing like spending time with the code to understand it better. And remember, you can always hover over the code that you don't understand. C# does a very good job at explaining what everything does. And don't forget to return a to-do view model with your to-do list. Now let's create our view model. So we're going to create a folder inside the models folder, and then a new file called todoviewmodel.cs. Now remember, a view model is exactly what it says. It's a model for the object that you want to bind to your view. So in our view, we're going to have a list of items and also a to-do object which is going to be bound to our form. Don't forget the using statement for the new folder. Let's pass the view model into our view in the index method. So we are declaring a variable called to-do list view model, and that's going to be what's returned from get all to-dos method. Now let's open the index file in our home folder, and this is the code for your table. Just ignore the to-div tags in the end. This view will be bound to the to-do view model with the declaration of the model on top. But our view is not recognizing that type. So we need to go to our view imports file, and that's where we declare using statements that we're going to use across our application. So let's include an using statement for our view models folder, and that feature helps us avoiding duplicated code. So if we go back to our view, the compiler doesn't complain anymore. Now notice that in the table that we created, we have a loop. So for each to-do item returned from the to-do list, we're creating rows for the table. So we are only wrapping that part of the table in the loop. Now we need to go back to our form view and change the model to to-do view model, otherwise you run into an error. And since we have a to-do item as part of our to-do view model, we need to change the references in our form accordingly, so they match the properties of the to-do item in the to-do view model. Again, if this is getting confusing, it's absolutely normal. Just go back and re-examine the code carefully until you understand it. So let's run the app to see if it works, and we are rendering our list of items, and if we add a new item, the page refreshes and we have the new list. So now we need to add a delete functionality to our app. Let's add a button, and that button is going to be inside a third column of our table. So here our button is going to be an input of type submit, and the value is going to be delete. So that's what's going to be written in the button. And we're going to handle the click events of that button with JavaScript. So we have an onClick property, and that means that when we click on that button, we're going to hit a method called delete to do, and we're going to pass the ID of that row or the ID of that to do item into that method. So we're going to write any JavaScript code for this application in the site.js file, which can be found in the JS folder inside the www root folder. So here we are declaring the delete to do function, and in the signature of this method we have an I parameter that we're passing to it, and that's the ID of our to do item. Now inside this method we are making an AJAX call using jQuery. So let's explain what these things are. jQuery is nothing more than a library that compiles code into JavaScript and makes it more readable and very easy to use. It's a very useful tool that's been around for a long time now and very popular amongst JavaScript developers. Usually you can identify jQuery code by the use of the $sign. Now AJAX is a technique for communicating with the server side without refreshing your page. It does that by creating request and response JavaScript objects to pass data between the browser and the server. Understanding JavaScript, jQuery, and AJAX is essential for full-stack web developers. I'm not going to go into detail about JavaScript since this tutorial is focused on C#, but I'm adding links to my favorite tutorials in these technologies, and I highly recommend you add them to your study plan. So here we're creating an AJAX call, and the first parameter is the URL. Here we need to have the name of the controller and the method that we're trying to hit. Then we have a type. In this situation, it's going to be a post because we're posting data into that method. And then we need to pass the data, which is going to be an object created on the fly with one property, and that's the ID that we're receiving when this method is called. And in case we receive a success response from the server, we're going to refresh the window. Now back in the controller, let's create the delete method, which is going to return a JSON result, remembering that JSON is a notation for objects. And the code inside that method is very straightforward. The only difference is that we're returning a JSON result with an empty object. And that's because in this application, we don't need to return any data from this method. So now let's give it a try. We run the app, add a new record, and try to delete it, and it deletes it and refreshes the page automatically. Now we need to add the update functionality to our app. So let's create a button very similar to the delete to do button. But this time, we're not going to directly update the data. First, we need to populate the form with the data from the row that we want to update. And we're going to do that using JavaScript, calling the populate form method and passing the ID that we want. In that method, we're going to make an AJAX call where we're going to get the data from the to-do item that we want to update. The difference here is that if we get a success response, we're going to use the power of JavaScript to manipulate the DOM, to manipulate the browser. And what we're doing here is fairly simple. We're getting the input for the name based on its ID and updating its value to the response name, and doing the same thing with the ID. And this ID is the ID of the HTML generated by ASP.NET. And we're going to do the same thing with the button. We're changing its value to update. And last but not least, we are changing the action of the form, the action attribute, to target the update method that we're going to create in the home controller. So back in the controller, let's create the populate form method. It's going to get the to-do item from the getById method that we're going to create and return a JSON result. So let's create the getById method, and the structure is very similar to the getAllToDos method. The difference is that it's only going to read one row from the database, and it won't return a list. It will only return a to-do item. And then just below the delete method, let's create the update method. And again, it's going to follow the same structure as the other methods that we use to communicate with our database, and refreshing the page with a redirect result. So let's run the app to see if it works. Populating the form works, and updating the to-do works as well. So let's open our DevTools to see the power of JavaScript in action. The initial state of this form has the action targeting the insert method. Once you click on update, that changes to the update method, and it changes the values of the button and the input. And very important, notice that we have an ID input that is hidden. So we don't let the user see that, but we are setting the ID to the ID of the requested to-do item and passing it as part of the to-do item object when we click on update. And once we click on it, the page refreshes and the initial state of the form is restored. And now that we have a fully functioning CRUD to-do application, let's add some styling. And we're going to do that by just adding a bunch of Bootstrap classes. Again, if you're just starting, I recommend you do a Bootstrap crash course to learn the basics, but you don't need to know a lot of it unless you want to be a front-end developer. Let's do the same thing in our form adding a bunch of Bootstrap classes. Then let's add some classes to the layout view. And finally, let's add some CSS to our site.css, which is in the CSS folder inside the www root folder. And that's the last step. You can get all the code necessary for styling in the GitHub link below. Let's test the application to see if everything still works. So we can add a to-do item, we can update an item, and we can also delete an item. That's it, we're done. Before we finish, I have a few suggestions for you. First, you probably noticed that we didn't add validation to our app. So maybe you can try that on your own and ask me questions if you get stuck. Also, try to recreate the project using something like different styling or a different business model. That will help you retain the material learned in this tutorial. Feel free to submit your code on GitHub and I'll be more than happy to review it. If you like this tutorial, please subscribe to the channel and don't forget to join our Discord channel in the link below so you can contact me and other students that love programming. Thanks for watching.